Topic Notes 5.2, Plankton. As you look out across the vastness of the ocean, it's easy to kind of feel like it seems empty, of course, because we're only seeing the surface, and you don't see towering trees growing with green leaves, you don't see savannas, you don't see all that stuff, but it is an incredibly productive area because of the smallest things around, and that is plankton, and that's what we're going to get into today. So our big main idea here is plankton forms the basis of the marine food web and plays an important role in the larval development of a majority of marine life. And of course, there's a number of specific targeted learning goals, so make sure you check them out. Now we need to start with some definitions. So the first is what we call nekton. Nekton are all actively swimming organisms whose movements are not governed by currents or tides. So we're talking fish, whales, things like that, things that swim around. Now this is in contrast to the term plankton, which describes a group of organisms with the following characteristics. They drift or weakly swim at the mercy of water motion and currents, which means essentially they can't really dictate where they move to a large degree. They can only weakly swim around, that's it. This includes many species of autotrophs, heterotrophs, predators, and grazers. So just because they're small doesn't mean they're limited to one particular role. And there are a range of sizes as well, from microscopic, which we generally think of, to larger jellyfish and actually some larger animals too. So we'll get into that. But there is a range of sizes as well. Now remember, plankton is not a taxonomic group. There are a lot of different taxonomic categories of organisms that are found in plankton, and we're going to look into that. But we can divide plankton into size, subdivided by size, and we do this mainly due to how we collect or catch to actually observe and document plankton. There's phytoplankton, nanoplankton, which are the smallest. We're talking under 2 micrometers. Then we have net plankton, which are above 20 micrometers. And they're generally large enough to be caught in most plankton nets, including our own when we do some plankton tows. But they do have a big range in sizes, and they can be above 200 millimeters as well. So they can be those larger specimens, such as jellyfish and whatnot. Now, plankton support the majority of the marine food web, and that is really an important part. Now we can generally talk about plankton in 2 big categories, zooplankton and phytoplankton. Now zooplankton would be the animal-like plankton, and they're primary and secondary consumers of other plankton. Then we have our phytoplankton, our plant-like plankton. Those are our autotrophic plankton that provide over 92% of marine productivity and nearly half of the world's productivity in general. Now, we've been mentioning phyto and zooplankton for a while now, but let's spend some time looking at what actually they are. And we'll start with phytoplankton and specifically diatoms, which are photosynthetic algae with siliceous skeletons, or what we call fustrals, and are the most common phytoplankton. Now, diatoms are unicellular, but they can form colonies in the shape of chains. They're also incredibly efficient. They can convert more than 50% of the light energy into carbohydrates, which is really awesome. And connected to that, they're very important in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which makes them great helpers in terms of stabilizing climate. They reproduce very rapidly with optimal conditions, so as long as you have light and nutrients availability. So they are a very important food source for primary consumers. And here you go, you can kind of see the variety of diatoms that are out there. They can be very pretty too. Now, dinoflagellates, on the other hand, are unicellular protists characterized by 1 or 2 whip-like flagella used for movement. Now, these guys can be armored with plates of carbohydrate cellulose, Most are autotrophic, including the symbiotic zooxanthellae we've talked about with corals. So they form that symbiotic relationship in the coral tissues. They are also principal organisms responsible for what we call harmful algae blooms, or HABs. This includes things like red tides. The toxins can contaminate fish and accumulate in shellfish, so that can be bad news. So although some dinoflagellates are really good, others in larger quantities can cause some problems. And here's just a look at a few different varieties of dinoflagellates that we can see in the water. Cyanobacteria is another one. They are photosynthetic bacteria, one of the earliest known forms of life, and they're responsible for the increase in oxygen levels in the atmosphere, allowing aerobic life to evolve on this planet. They account for at least half of the ocean's total primary productivity, and they're the most abundant phytoplankton. Their filamentous forms can be caught in plankton nets themselves, and high nutrients, including pollution, can cause blooms of cyanobacteria, and some of them can be toxic. So in near-shore areas, when we have those high nutrient pollutions, cyanobacteria can become a problem. Now let's turn our attention back to zooplankton, and we're going to, of course, start where the food web dictates, right? And that would be with the herbivorous zooplankton, the primary consumers, right? And they are a vital link between phytoplankton and higher trophic levels. So we have a group of protozoan zooplankton that can catch the small, tiny phytoplankton that's really too small for any other herbivores. And this is important because there's a lot of energy there to be transferred up the trophic level. So you need a small herbivore to be able to consume that very tiny phytoplankton. And there are various different individual species in this group. We're talking about various different flagellates, ciliates, foraminiferae, and radiolarans. You don't have to remember all of those, but just kind of understand there's a category of them. And they're also a little weird because some of them are actually also capable of photosynthesis themselves. Now let's go to the copepods. Now copepods are small crustaceans that dominate the net plankton. Almost 70% or more of the community are copepods. Their bodies are subdivided into head, thorax, and abdomen. They have 2 antennae that aid swimming, and their exoskeletons are made out of calcium carbonate. And they can include spikes for protection and surface area for flotation. And basically what that means, if you have large extensions, that makes it a little harder for you to sink in the water column. It helps catch surface tension a little bit. Now, copepods graze on phytoplankton, but they can also be carnivorous as well. And they're really cool because they use their appendages to create water currents. It's really neat. It's kind of like they create these little water currents by puffing their little, rotating their little appendages, and that current brings in food close enough to them to grab a hold of and then consume. And in plankton slides, when you put them in a microscope, you can sometimes see them doing this. It's really neat. Now let's talk about krill. Krill are shrimp-like zooplankton that can grow up to about 6 centimeters in the Antarctic. They feed on phytoplankton, zooplankton, and detritus, so they're big carnivores in that instance and primary and secondary consumers. They are large enough to be an important food source for other animals such as seabirds, fish, and whales, which is a huge thing for big whales. Now, on the larger side of things, we have jellyfish. Now, they're considered plankton because they have limited mobility. All they really can do is pulse the bell of their medusa form to move around a little bit. Their tentacles have stinging cells, and they use that to capture prey. So they are a big predator in the plankton community. Now, we can group zooplankton in 2 different categories based on their life history. We have holoplankton and meroplankton. Now, holoplankton remains plankton their entire lives, which means they never change. They're always in the plankton community. That would be copepods, krill, and jellyfish. They are plankton their entire lives. Now, this is opposed to meroplankton, which live part of their lives as plankton. Now, meroplankton include most of the larval forms of all the other marine life. That includes things like crab, shrimp, fish, clams, and conchs. All have larval stages. On the left there, you'll see a larval stage of a tube anemone. Then there's a larval fish in the middle and a larval octopus on the right. So these do not stay as plankton. When they grow up, they become either nekton or something that lives on the benthic surface on the bottom. Now, plankton communities are limited by the available nutrients. So in the open ocean, localized aggregations called patches are present based on nutrient input from upwelling or other processes. So essentially, wherever you have nutrients and plenty of access to light, you have patches of productivity and phytoplankton, and thus all the rest of the food chain. Species that feed on plankton must be able to find those patches. So they're going to migrate from one area to the next to locate that. And that can happen seasonally, of course, in some regions, but there's also some larger scale changes and shifts that occur as well. And of course, when we look at the composition of plankton in terms of coastal regions, you tend to have more meroplankton in terms of percentage, simply because you've got a lot of organisms that live there and give off planktonic larvae. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about here is vertical migration of zooplankton. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon we first discovered when ships started to carry sonar and radar. And what they would find is literally something that looks like the seafloor rising up to meet them as we transition from day into night. Well, what that really was is all of the density of the zooplankton that started to go from the deep water, something near a mile down in the dark, up towards the surface at night to feed. And that is the key thing. Why are these zooplankton moving to the surface at night? They're moving there to feed. Now, let's think about this logically. The photic zone is at the surface. That's where all the phytoplankton are. That's where the food is being generated. Now, in the surface waters, it is during the day, there's nowhere to hide. So all these krill, these little shrimps, things like that, they are all vulnerable to being consumed, right? So if they spend their daylight hours a mile deep where it's nice and dark, they are more protected. They are more hidden. And then at night, when it's dark at the surface, they come up to that surface and they feed on the phytoplankton that's up there. And then as we get into the daylight hours again, they reverse course and sink for safety, for being hidden. All right, everybody, that is it for today's note set. Remember, main idea, plankton forms the base of the marine food web and plays an important role in the larval development of a majority of marine life. So, of course, until next time, keep learning.